Hello there, Year 10. Firstly, thanks for your completing the tests on Monday. It was really good to see how many people could answer all 30 of those questions really well and how high the scores were. So that's great. It shows that you've been keeping up really well with the home learning. We're now going to start the very last section of our thematic study on empires and migration through time to do with Britain. So far we've looked at the British Empire and its growth and its decline and its ultimate decolonisation. Today we're going to start an inquiry, a series of lessons where we look at migration to Britain. So the inquiry question, the overall question that we're trying to answer over the next few lessons is going to be, what is the big story of migration to Britain? And luckily, we've actually done some of this big story already. While we were still at school, right back at the start of Year 10, I know you probably can't remember that now, but we looked at those first groups of migrants to Britain after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the Anglo-Saxons who came from Germany and Denmark from sort of the 5th century AD onwards as the Roman Empire was collapsing. And interestingly, there's been some recent scholarship suggesting that it wasn't as though the Romans all completely left and a new group of people came in. There was much more mixing than that going on. A really interesting book I've been reading called The Making of the English, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. The Vikings, of course, coming from Scandinavia. And if we think back to the big factors that we've spent so much time looking at, what was it that caused the Vikings to come over? Yeah, there was war and violence and those Viking raids in the early days. There was the technology of their longboats that enabled them to make that sea crossing from Scandinavia. And there were the economic resources, of course, that they were looking for in the monasteries and so on. The Normans and then the French. There was a lot of migration from Normandy. First of all, for the Norman conquest itself, those people who came over and attacked the Anglo-Saxons, and then subsequently to that, some more peaceful migrations as well. War being a big factor in it, though. Religion, if you recall, William the Conqueror persuaded his fellow Normans to come and take part in the conquest because he said, the Pope's on my side, you'll get a place in heaven if you do that. And yet again, economic resources, as always, playing a part in motivating people to get up from their home in Normandy and come over to England. So what we're going to be looking at over the next few lessons, that's the bit we've already studied. And your first task today is a timeline. Just I want to include these groups of people on the timeline, just so you can sort of see that big picture. And it's on the instruction sheet I've given you. So if you could add on the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans onto that timeline, in that sort of order, we're going to be looking over the next few lessons at the groups of people who migrated to Britain from 1500 onwards. We're simplifying here. Obviously, there's always been people migrating all over this planet in very complicated and diverse ways throughout all of human history. We are simplifying here to try and hone in on some key significant groups of people who migrated here. So, as you know, in around the year 1500, or 1492 to be exact, the world changed forever. With Christopher Columbus's voyage over to the Americas, suddenly the world became a much smaller place, and there was, for the first time, there was contact between Europe, the old world, and Europe and Asia, and the Americas, the new world. And all of those changes brought about a huge movement of peoples all around the globe, and migration sort of sped up in a way, both to Britain and from Britain. But remember, we're focusing on people coming to Britain. And so the groups of people we're going to look at in detail over the next few lessons are going to be the Huguenots. That's an annoying word to spell. But it's pronounced Huguenots. It's a French word, and it's a word referring to French Protestants. They came to Britain from the late 1500s right up to the 1700s. So this is a long migration over a couple of hundred years. France being, at the time, a Catholic country. Nowadays, there's a lot of Catholics in France still, but France is a republic which is officially secular. It doesn't have a state religion, unlike Britain. At the time, Protestants in France were persecuted, and so they wanted to come to a Protestant country, and Britain was just over the English Channel. So I want you to mark the Huguenots onto your timeline, and next lesson we're going to be looking in detail at those people. Moving forward to the 19th century, so really from 1800, well, I mean, I'm talking here about migration from Ireland. There's always been migration between the island we're on now and the island of Ireland, which is just over the Irish Sea. Ever since there have been people on these two islands, there's been migration between the two islands. But migration from Ireland to Britain increased rapidly in the 19th century, from around 1800 onwards, as the Industrial Revolution was really underway in this country. And we're going to be exploring reasons for that, and reasons for that migration really going into overdrive in the 1840s. A huge number of people, millions of people, left Ireland in the 1840s. Most of them actually went to the United States or to Australia or to Canada. Lots of them came to Britain, and there are some very shameful reasons for that for anybody who's British, to do with people starving. There was a great starvation in Ireland, and we're going to look at the reasons for that horrendous event and try and confront that shameful episode in our history. A little bit later in the 19th century, from around the 1880s to the 1900s, there was a large influx of migrants coming from Russia, who were members of the Jewish religion, being persecuted in their country. We're going to look in detail at the causes for that persecution. Again, most of those people wanted to go to the USA. Britain being in between the western part of Russia and the USA, a lot of people came to Britain on the way to the USA and ended up staying here because maybe they couldn't make it all the way over to New York. But also some people were preferring to actually come to Britain as well. We're going to look at how, the causes of that migration. We're also going to look at the way that those people were treated when they came here as refugees, and we're going to have a look at how they transformed Britain and some of the high street businesses and companies and shops that you'll all be very familiar with. We'll find out that actually those companies were set up by refugees coming from Russia in the 1880s, 1890s. You'll notice my timeline, the one on your sheet goes up to 2000, my timeline only goes up to 1900, and that's because in the 20th century the story of migration is much more complex, and I'm going to leave that for next time because we're going to sort of probably have a whole board filled just with what happened in the 20th century. So your first task is to just fill in these groups of people so you can kind of see that bigger picture, what was going on, when were different groups of people moving here. You know, it's a simplified version, as I've said. Then your next task, there's a video I've put a link to on Show My Homework by David Olusoga, the historian. We're actually going to, before we look at these main groups here who we're studying, we're going to look at Britain in the 1500s and the 1600s, because as I've said, the story is more complex than this suggests. The video talks about people of African and Asian origin. Actually, the video is just about people of African origin living in England during the Tudor period. And there's a couple of questions I want you to answer when you watch that video. Then there's an article on BBC Bitesize I want you to read, that's the bit that talks about people of African origin, but also people of Asian origin. So there was already quite a multicultural society in England at that time. What I want you to focus on for that when you've read that second bit is the changing experience. How did the experience of those migrants change from the 1500s, the Tudor period, the 16th century as it's otherwise known, up into the 17th century? Now, we know from our study of empire that in the 17th century is when the East India Company is rising to prominence, and also when the transatlantic slave trade is taking off. What I'm interested in is you finding out, how did those developments in the British Empire, how did they affect the people who were living in Britain, who were from African or Asian backgrounds? How did their treatment change? How did their experience of living here change? And why do you think this was? What's the correlation between what was going on in the empire and the experience of migrants living in this country? That's your work for today. I'll be back on Monday with another video. We'll be talking about the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and enjoy the work. I'll see you then.